Hello, Tricia.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay,
Okay.
it's 10:03 a.m. So we will begin now.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. Ciao Selamat
Good
pagi.
morning. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine, loud and clear. I'd like to welcome all of you who are joining us from Malaysia, from Taiwan, and anywhere else in the world at Ideas webinar titled Malaysia, Taiwan, and the CPTPP, an opportunity for growth. I'd like to just highlight that we are welcoming some friends who are physically in the office of the Taiwan Institute of Economic Research, which is what you'll be seeing on your screen.
Lateralize coming. Lateralize.
Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning to all of our guests who are just attending in a physical conference room in Taiwan, Taipei. Taiwan is in a fortunate situation in which they have zero COVID-19 cases. So they are able to meet physically in person, whereas we in Malaysia are unfortunately stuck at home, and we have been having a series of third spike in COVID cases recently. So that's why the rest of us are calling in from our homes. But anyway, to return back to the webinar, once again, I welcome all of you who are joining us to our webinar this morning on the CPTPP, or the Comprehensive Partnership of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we are very pleased to have with us this morning a series of very distinguished speakers. But before I get there, I'd like to just talk about the context of where Ideas is with regards to the topic. And Ideas, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, for those of you who don't know or are introduced to Ideas for the first time, we are an independent think tank, nonprofit organization based in Kuala Lumpur. And we have been doing very deep research in the area of open trade with specific reference to the CPTPP. We were also conducting research on the previous version of the CPTPP at a time called the TPPA. We have been one of the advocates for such a multilateral trade agreement. And within the CPTPP, this is actually following the launch of a policy paper and report that was written by our own research director, Lawrence Todd, within Ideas. And the report talks about the economic benefits that would take place if Malaysia were to ratify the CPTPP agreement. The report also delves into another area in which we explore what the benefits would be for Malaysia if Taiwan would also to ratify the CPTPP. So for those of you who have had access to the report, if you have not read it yet, please go to our website and download it. It's full of statistics and graphs, and those of us who are policy wonks would appreciate all the figures and facts that are laid out there. In short, Ideas report finds that if Malaysia were to ratify the CPTPP, this would increase our GDP by 1% and provide more than 100,000 new jobs and employment opportunities. And we also believe, based on our calculations, that if Taiwan were to ratify the CPTPP and join in the partnership as well, this would also increase our GDP by a further 0.15%. But I think Lawrence, our presenter later, will be in a better position to explain the details. But I just wanted to say in short that Ideas continues to support an open trade regime. And of course, this also will give us opportunities to do a lot of reforms internally with regards to chapters like the public procurement chapter, the chapter on state-owned enterprises, SOEs. We believe that this would provide the impetus for Malaysia to take the next step forward in truly not just opening up the economy, but also seriously addressing the structural problems that have been problematic for Malaysia for many years. And this is an opportunity for us to address those problems even if it comes through a trade agreement. So with that, I just kept it short. I just like to maybe highlight the names of the people who are going to be featured this morning. So how we will do this is we will have now another set of opening remarks by Dr. Hua Chia-Cheng, the Deputy Director, Division 2 of the Taiwan Institute of Economic Research. And then we will have a presentation of the report by our Research Director within Ideas. And then we will have commentaries from 3 guests, Professor Evelyn Devadasan, Vice President of the Malaysian Economic Association, Dr. Lai Yi-chung, the President of Prospect Foundation in Taiwan, and last but not least, Dr. Shankaran Nambiar, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research. So I will talk more about their profiles later when I introduce them. But first, without further ado, may I please invite Dr. Hua Chia-Cheng, Deputy Director of Taiwan Institute of Economic Research, to provide his opening remarks.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And nice to see you. We are so healthy in this COVID-19 pandemic. Although the COVID-19 pandemic is so serious in the world, so we use the webinar to discuss these important issues. CPTPP is the most important high quality multilateral FTA for several countries. So Taiwan always have the aggressive to participate at this agreement, but we must prepare for ourselves to join this CPTPP. We know the ideas study these issues for more than 1 year. All of us very expected to see the result. So today we have the opportunity to see the results from the ideas. And so today there are several experts to discuss with you after the Lawrence presentation. Now we give the time for the Lawrence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Dr. Hua Chia-Cheng. Just to let everyone know, we actually have 29 participants calling in from outside. So it's not just people that you see on the screen, but we have a lot more people outside of the screen as well who are in attendance and listening to us today. So without further ado, I'd like to now introduce Lawrence Todd, who is the Research Director at Ideas, and he has been the chief author of the research, and he has very in-depth detailed knowledge of the Malaysian economy as well as Taiwan now after authoring this report. So over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Trisha, and good morning to everybody. Very pleased to have the opportunity to present alongside such distinguished other speakers. It's a very generous introduction. This is certainly a group effort by several members of the team at Ideas, and also with some external assistance as well. As mentioned, this is a project we've been working on for several months, in fact, over a year, meeting with businesses in Malaysia and also in Taiwan, as well as conducting some economic analysis of the potential of CPTPP from both the Malaysia and the perspective of Taiwan joining also. So I'll just be sharing my screen and hopefully that will be clear to everybody. Okay, I will try to keep my presentation to less than 15 or 20 minutes tops. So forgive me if I rush over any of the details, but as Trisha mentioned, the report is available online for anybody who's interested to download. So I want to start with some comments on the research context. So I think most of you will be familiar with the timeline of the CPTPP. This is, of course, started life as the TPP, which led by the United States with 11 other members. But then subsequently, following the election of President Donald Trump, the United States withdrew from the agreement. It was subsequently renegotiated and amended in certain key respects to be reconstituted as the CPTPP the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership with all the previous members except the United States. That new revised agreement was signed on March 2018 and has entered into force for several of the members, most recently Vietnam early last year. But for Malaysia, despite having signed the agreement, there has not been a formal decision to ratify and implement the agreement. So that's the current status for Malaysia. In terms of the Malaysian government's position, there has been some questions over the government's policy on ratification. Previously, the previous Prime Minister, Tun Dr. Mahathir, indicated that the government would ratify CPTPP, but that there would be some further time before a final decision was made. But he also expressed quite a lot of skepticism about the agreement. The former finance minister, Lim Guan Eng, commented that, in fact, the Pakatan Harapan government had decided against ratification, and that position had been endorsed. But the current International Trade and Industries Minister, Azmin Ali, has indicated that MITI is undertaking consultations as a step prior to ratification. So at the moment, there's no firm decision for or against, it would appear, but the process is slowly being followed through to prepare the ground for ratification should the government decide to do that. Outside of Malaysia, the CPTPP has also undergone developments, with potential new members announcing their interest to join. So Taiwan announced its interest in 2016, the UK has announced interest in 2018, Thailand announced interest, and Colombia has announced interest. This is just a selection of the potential new members, but it's intended just to demonstrate the breadth with potential members from as far away as the UK to nearer with Thailand, to East Asia and Taiwan, to South America and Colombia. So the question is, should this change Malaysia's calculations? If these CPTPP is going to grow, does that make CPTPP more or less attractive from the Malaysian perspective? And this report is going to focus on Taiwan. Finally, I think, of course, we can't escape the important context of the pandemic. So Malaysia's export and FDI-led growth is, of course, threatened by the pandemic. UNCTAD predicts that there'll be a 45% reduction in global FDI flows to developing Asia in 2020 because of the pandemic. And that drives a certain context for thinking about trade and investment. So we see scarcity in FDI because of reductions linked to the pandemic, and that leads to intense intra-region competition. We also see that puts further pressure on how competitive Malaysia is relative to other countries in terms of its position within global value chains. And therefore, there's a central question, which is how the economic recovery strategy needs to focus on enhancing Malaysia's relative competitiveness within the region. So that sets out the context for this research, that Malaysia's position on CPTPP remains unclear, that there are potential for new members, including Taiwan, and that the pandemic is putting increasing pressure on Malaysia's regional competitiveness. So finally, Ideas, as Trish has mentioned, has engaged consistently on the TPPA and its successor, the CPTPP, through media engagement, roundtables, events, and publications, of which this is the latest. So Malaysia has signed the CPTPP, but so far has not ratified or implemented the agreement. Several potential members, such as Taiwan, have expressed interest to join and are actively pursuing accession. And the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the need to look for new sources of growth. So the research question we consider is, what is the economic impact if Malaysia ratifies CPTPP? And what is the impact to Malaysia's economy if Taiwan also joins? So the structure for the rest of the presentation, I will touch on what CPTPP means for Malaysia, the current Malaysia-Taiwan relationship, the impact of CPTPP ratification and Taiwan's membership. Then I'll look specifically from the fourth industrial revolution perspective, and then finally touch on the COVID dimension before concluding. So what CPTPP means for Malaysia. So in this section, I'm going to just unpack some of the main provisions of the CPTPP and how they relate to Malaysia, and look at that particularly from the Taiwanese perspective, given that's the focus of this research. So the CPTPP consists of economies totaling about 13.5% of global GDP, nearly 500 million customers. It's also an extremely high standard of FTA with provisions beyond just normal trade related provisions into competition, public procurement, regulation of other areas. And it's predicted to result in income gains of nearly 150 billion US dollars. So in terms of the main provisions of the agreement, of course, we start with tariffs. So imports from Taiwan rather to Malaysia are still subject to most favored nation tariffs, which in the main export commodities from Taiwan can in some cases be notably high. So under Malaysia's commitments in the CPTPP, it's committed to reduce tariffs to 0%. But there are some significant exemptions and transitional periods. So there's 16-year transitional periods on some products, specifically tobacco and alcohol, 10-year transitional periods on other products, and also then some quotas, particularly for agricultural imports, such as poultry, pork, milk, and eggs. Moving beyond tariffs and non-tariff measures, Malaysia has a range of NTMs in place, which apply to all imports, including those from Taiwan. So across the range of imports, there's several hundred, ranging across different measures from price controls, quantity controls, inspections, health and safety, as well as technical barriers. So here the CPTPP goes quite far in establishing a number of commitments that Malaysia has signed up to. So for health and safety requirements, Malaysia is committed to pursue the minimum necessary approach to certification and to take account of World Trade Organization standards. It needs to apply equivalence to the measures of other parties. Thank you. And Malaysia is required to adopt international standards for other non-tariff measures and must some other sort of more niche requirements, such as accepting suppliers' declaration of conformity for medical devices, which is an important new area of growth in Malaysia's industry and should reduce the cost and complexity of trade between CPTPP members. So beyond tariffs, the CPTPP goes quite far in terms of trying to lower these non-tariff barriers as well. Beyond trading goods, the CPTPP also includes a number of provisions to try to reduce the frictions relating to services trade and investment. This includes protections for investors, including investor-state dispute settlement systems, and also easing the movement of people between CPTPP members. So we can see on the left here that Malaysia continues to maintain reasonably high restrictions on services trade across a number of different services sectors. I think here, given that this is where I think many of the more controversial aspects of the CPTPP relate to, because it relates to the trade in services and provisions on investment, some of which are quite controversial, it's important to highlight, I think, that Malaysia's negotiating team was able to secure a significant number of exemptions. I won't go through them all here, but you can see, for example, that foreign equity restrictions are maintained in some sectors, such as car manufacturing. The Malaysian negotiating team ensured to secure broad powers in order to maintain the ability of the government to pursue Bumiputra development. Petronas, of course, retains its monopoly over petroleum production, and so on. So although the CPTPP is a significant agreement in as far as it does try to establish a new level of openness for services and investment, I think it's also important to reflect on the fact that the exemptions are quite significant, in particular in those areas that are most sensitive to Malaysia. There are, as I mentioned, many other provisions of CPTPP that go beyond traditional trade provisions, including regulation of state-owned enterprises, requirements for non-discriminations by SOEs in commercial activities, prohibition on non-commercial assistance by or for SOEs, and so on. And again, there are some important exemptions here for many of the most important SOEs in Malaysia, such as Petronas, Felda, the DFIs. But this is one of the reasons I think that CPTPP is significant, both controversial, but also why many are in favor of it, which is that it also drives this reform of areas such as SOEs. Similarly on government procurement, so I'm very happy to discuss this in more detail. So the procurement reforms try to promote non-discrimination in public procurement and facilitate greater access, including for foreign providers of services and public works. However, there are also significant exemptions that are maintained in Malaysia's commitments, including margin of price preferences for Bumiputra companies and domestic firms. We also see new provisions on e-commerce to try and facilitate the flow of data for legitimate business purposes, non-discrimination of digital products, trying to raise the bar in terms of consumer protection rules and so on. And finally, intellectual property. So this is quite controversial, but the most controversial chapters were suspended when the US withdrew, but there still are some important provisions on national treatment and non-discrimination and transparency when setting new rules for IP and so on. There are other areas that we could also touch on, such as the labor provisions that are also quite notable for their presence within the FTA. But so happy to get into that in the Q&A, but I just wanted to illustrate here the breadth of the provisions within the CPTPP and how they relate to Malaysia currently. So of course there are arguments and just, as I said, controversy around the CPTPP. So there are many concerns around the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, concerns around IPR, health policy, capital controls, and government procurement, just to name a few. I think that some of these are important policy discussions actually that we shouldn't dismiss and that we should have an open, honest conversation about. And it may well be that alongside ratification of CPTPP, there are other steps we need to take to mitigate any legitimate concerns. That being said, I think there are also important safeguards within the CPTPP itself, such as the fact that the ISDS safeguarded against frivolous cases and so on, various provisions within the treaty itself to try to ensure that that doesn't lead to negative outcomes for members. We could have a long discussion about IP and how it relates to medicine prices, but I think it's clear that IP alone is not the major factor in terms of driving medical prices, and we can look at other policies to reduce any impact. CPTPP explicitly protects the rights of nations to adopt necessary measures related to health and the environment. Also, special exemptions allow countries to maintain their own foreign exchange regime and also to take action against speculative currency flows. And also MITI, crucially, as I mentioned, negotiated for domestic contractors to gain priority of tendering for public procurement. So clearly I can't do the whole discussion about CPTPP justice in one slide, but just an attempt to summarize some of the key arguments and responses. Okay, so now focusing on the Taiwan dimension. So I think as a starting point, we want to try to understand the current Malaysia-Taiwan economic relationship. So in terms of trade, Taiwan's share of Malaysia's total trade has remained relatively stable. So you can see here on the left that Taiwan's share of total trade has retained at about 5%, while other major trading partners have increased or decreased over the last 25 or so years. Taiwan, as a result, consistently ranks among Malaysia's top trading partners. And among Malaysia's top trading partners is one of the very few not to enjoy some form of preferential trading agreement with Malaysia, either as a bilateral trading agreement or as a member of ASEAN, as you can see here on the right. Alongside the United States and Germany, Taiwan is the only top 10 trading partner not to enjoy some kind of preferential trading agreement with Malaysia. In terms of the trade between Malaysia and Taiwan, Malaysia's exports to Taiwan are dominated by machinery and electronics, and also some primary commodities such as natural gas and palm oil. And Malaysia's imports from Taiwan have a similarly dominated by machinery and electronics, also with some chemical products and naturally, as you'd expect, a lower presence of natural resources. It's also important to highlight the strong people-to-people links between Malaysia and Taiwan. So we have approximately 380,000 Taiwanese tourists in Malaysia in 2018. We estimate receipts of about 1.2 billion ringgit rising from that. Nearly half a million Malaysian tourists to Taiwan. And also a significant exchange of students with nearly 20,000 Malaysian students pursuing tertiary education in Taiwan as of the latest statistics. And a lot of these links have been increased as a result of the new Southbound Policy, which is Taiwan's policy platform to try to engage its southern neighbors. This relationship is underpinned by a very strong investment presence. So there are over 1,700 Taiwanese enterprises currently operating in Malaysia. This is quite a long-standing relationship spread across several different sectors, but most notably, of course, electronics, but actually moving into some new sectors such as biotechnology and other high technology related sectors. This is part of a general strategy by Taiwan to invest in the region, building its supply chain across members of ASEAN from which those members have benefited, including Malaysia, due to the complementarity between what Taiwanese industry offers and the sort of available capital and skills in Malaysia and other ASEAN member states. So in terms of trying to understand that trade relationship in a little bit more detail, Malaysia and Taiwan have a high degree of trade complementarity. So on the left here, you can see that Malaysia and Taiwan's trade complementarity is high and is notably actually higher than for the rest of CPTPP. This means that what Malaysia and Taiwan trade is well matched. So what Malaysia exports, Taiwan tends to import and vice versa. And this generally is a good rule of thumb for whether trade liberalization would lead to an expansion of trade between parties. At the same time, the export concentration of Taiwan to Malaysia is also quite high. So that means that the types of products that that Taiwan exports to Malaysia are quite concentrated in electronics and machinery in particular, and they're not spread across many different product groups. So that can indicate two things. Firstly, it shows there's a strength in that trading relationship for that product, but also it might mean that other products are struggling to be competitive. So it may be that if we can liberalize that trading relationship, it would mean that other products might also be competitive alongside electronics. So Taiwan is a significant source of value added in Malaysia's gross exports, ranking 6th in 2015, which is the latest latest year for which we have good data. And equally, Malaysia also contributes to Taiwan's value added, and is one of the countries is in the top 10 of countries where Malaysia is contributing to their exports. So this, given the relatively small size of both Taiwan and Malaysia's economy, I think highlights that there's a strong set of industrial linkages that allow industry in Taiwan to add value to Malaysia's industry, and that's related in the value added in the exports and vice versa. Okay, so I'm moving now to the impact of CPTPP ratification and Taiwanese membership. I'm conscious that I'm at risk of running over time, so I'll be as quick as I can. So the analysis methodology is using a CGE model used to estimate the impacts on trade, GDP, and employment based on international studies with adjustments to reflect Taiwan's potential membership, and the results broadly consistent with other estimates, obviously reflecting the differences we've made to accommodate Taiwan's membership. So we, as Tricia indicated, that the headline is that we estimate gains across both imports and exports, driving an overall increase in GDP, which in turn drives an increase in employment. About a 1% total gain in GDP, and all these gains are increased if Taiwan also joins. So the blue section represents Malaysia's ratification, and then the additional gains from Taiwan's membership. In terms of the impact in trade, we see an increase in imports and exports across all goods categories as a result of both CPTPP membership and then Taiwan's subsequent membership. Taiwan's subsequent membership in particular adds to the manufacturing exports and manufacturing imports, but it results in a net increase in manufacturing output. So there are a few caveats to this kind of analysis, which I'm sure Dr. Shankaran and Prof. Evelyn will highlight as well, which is it really only is able to focus on the measurable provisions and does not reflect some of the additional positive externalities, such as improved investor sentiment, which could also contribute to a positive economic impact. But the underlying message is clear that CPTPP represents a kind of positive economic policy choice for Malaysia, and that Taiwan's membership would further extend those gains. I think some additional benefits, the type of which are hard to capture in the model, is this sort of copper bottoming of Malaysia's open trade and investment system and the signal that would send, strengthening of institutional governance, strong signal to investors amid political uncertainty, and as part of a building block of a new strategy for a competitive economy. On the other hand, the risks of further delaying a decision on ratification, we risk sliding in relative competitiveness within the region at a time when that is of increasing importance. Prolonged policy uncertainty may weigh on domestic and foreign investment, which has been quite sluggish, even coming into the pandemic. And we also miss the opportunity to shape the approach to new members in Malaysia's interest. So, for example, Taiwan's membership, where that would be highly advantageous to Malaysia. If Malaysia is not in there as a key member, it won't be able to maximize the potential benefits from that. Okay, I'm just going to very quickly highlight also the impacts on Malaysia's efforts to transition to the fourth industrial revolution. And I think the reason to do this is to really highlight that industrial collaboration that exists between Malaysia and Taiwan and how that can be further unlocked. So Malaysia's imports across, if we compare Taiwan and other members of CPTPP, and what we control for here is looking at what do we use those inputs for? So here in this chart, we can see that imports from Taiwan are really dominated by intermediate goods, things that are being used in the production process. So that underscores that the bulk of trade between Malaysia and Taiwan is for industry use. And if we then control that and look at what is high technology, intermediate, and capital goods versus all other products, we can see that actually across Taiwan and all other members, Malaysia is importing more high technology, intermediate, and capital goods from Taiwan than from any other member. And those types of goods really dominate Malaysia's trade basket with Taiwan. So that really underscores that high technology relationship. Malaysia has signaled in particular the following sectors as being priorities for its fourth industrial revolution: E&E, machinery, chemicals, medical devices, aerospace, and then some selected other sectors. So if we look specifically at these, we can see that again, Taiwan is a very significant trading partner already relative to CPTPP members. So in terms of intermediate and capital goods in those priority sectors, particularly of course electronics, as we can see from this chart, Taiwan is a crucial partner and is also an important source of exports. Okay, so the exports naturally tend to be centered around Singapore because of Singapore's status as a trading hub, but I think nonetheless it's significant that Malaysia's exports in these sectors are also driven by, are also high for Taiwan. And then, but finally, and we can unpack this research more in the report, but we identify significant untapped export potential in these 4 IR focus sectors among CPTPP members, especially if we include Taiwan. So particularly if we look, say, at electronics, here is the additional export potential of about, I didn't put the figures on there, but it's about over $1 billion, as I recall. And a significant chunk of that is represented by the Taiwanese market. So it's not just that the relationship between Malaysia and Taiwan is strong already, it's that it can further deepen actually in these key priority sectors of the fourth industrial revolution. So electronics, machinery, chemicals, and medical devices. In all 4 of these categories, we see significant export opportunities for CPTPP countries and also for Taiwan, and those benefits being increased if Taiwan is added, particularly as you can see for electronics and for chemicals. So just very briefly, because most of this research took place before the pandemic, so we wanted just to add some comments to put this in the context of what's happened in 2020. So the first is the recovery. Of course, we're about to see the budget this week in a year where Malaysia's seen a GDP contraction in the second quarter, and we're of course looking for every opportunity to boost growth. Ratification of CPTPP, of course, can't be put on the same scale as the impact of the pandemic on the lockdown, but it does represent a fiscally neutral policy option to stimulate trade and investment and support the economic recovery. Secondly, as we mentioned, supply chains. COVID has further stimulated MNCs to think through their supply chain relocation, a process that was underway already and is seeing further shifts. And the ratification of CPTPP kind of positions Malaysia well and enhances its regional competitiveness as that process is unfolding. And finally, in digitalization. So I think the pandemic has underscored for all of us how important digitalization is, both for production and also consumption. And insofar as CPTPP supports the process of Malaysia's transition to the fourth industrial revolution, it can also support that process of digitalization. And Taiwan's membership in particular, where Taiwan is a leading player in all those sectors, and building on the strong industrial relationship that we already have, Taiwan as a CPTPP member can be a strong partner for Malaysia's efforts to upgrade its industry. So finally, I'll just offer these concluding comments. Ratification of CPTPP remains an option to stimulate economic gains in the short term. But more importantly, it can form part of a wider strategy to enhance the competitiveness of the Malaysian economy, including through 4IR. As CPTPP expands, the benefits from ratification can increase further. And if Taiwan joins, it would significantly enhance the economic benefits for Malaysia, in particular through deepening industrial collaboration. And finally, ongoing uncertainty over ratification risks missing out on these benefits and losing out on the opportunity to shape the future direction of CPTPP in Malaysia's favor. Okay, I'm very sorry for slightly overrunning my time there, Tricia, but very happy to pick up any points, and sorry that I couldn't cover everything in full detail, but the report is available for anybody who's interested to read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I think that just underscores your enthusiasm for the research and the results of the research. So yeah, don't want to summarize too much, but it's clear, I think, to me and to everyone watching that based on our research, there are gains for Malaysia and Taiwan. As I said in the introduction on ratification of the CPTPP, Malaysia and Taiwan have very strong industrial linkages which would be further deepened with such a trade agreement. Both countries would actually benefit if both countries were to also ratify. And I think the final point is that, yes, while there are competitive benefits for Malaysia, the important points that you put on your conclusion slide are quite clear. There are benefits, but there's also the other costs and the risk of losing out were we not to ratify it. So with that, I'd like to now invite our three panelists, each of whom is going to speak for about 10 minutes each. I would like to first invite Professor Evelyn Devadesan. So let me introduce her. So Professor Evelyn is professor at the Faculty of Economics and Administration at University of Malaya in Malaysia. She's also the Vice President of the Malaysian Economic Association. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Malaya in 2006 and her Master's in Social Sciences Economics from NUS, National University of Singapore in 1992. She looks at international trade and regional integration. So I think she's very well suited to talk about this topic itself. She has many other positions. She serves as associate editor to the International Journal of Social Economics and member to the editorial boards of the Journal of Contemporary Asia and Institutions and Economies. She interestingly is also engaged with a joint project between the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions and the Asian and Pacific Regional Organization, and many, many other affiliations. I won't read all of them, but she has affiliations with the ADB, with the World Bank, with ADBI, Economic Research Institute of East Asia, UNTAD, and so on and so forth. So very established, very well conversed with all the issues of free trade and economics. And Prof. Evelyn, I don't believe you have any slides. So if you could just have 10 minutes for comments. And you know, since the budget is also taking place on Friday, I mean, I'm not sure whether you want to weave any kind of wish lists for what's happening in Malaysia this very week itself. So over to Professor Evelyn.
Thank you so much, Tricia. And firstly, I would like to record my sincere thanks to the Institute for Economic Democracy, IDEAS, sorry, Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs for this invitation to share my thoughts. The main message that comes out from this report is that if Malaysia were to ratify the CPTPP and Taiwan were to join this agreement, then there would be gains in trade, and this would then translate into output and employment gains. So I will base my comments on the trade gains per se, particularly on merchandise goods, trade gains in merchandise goods. And I'll comment along 3 points. One is on the tariffs, non-tariff measures, and the impending gains as per the report. Second is on harmonization of regulations, particularly on NTMs. And third, on supply chains, intermediate goods, and value-added trade. Now, under the first main area, which is tariffs, NTMs, and trade gains, I would like to just highlight what the report says. The report shows that there are disproportionate gains across different sectors based on the CGE model. But I was wondering whether, the fact that Malaysia and Taiwan's trade is highly concentrated in electronics, whether it has also been considered that both countries are party to the information technology agreement, and therefore IT products cross borders almost at zero tariffs. So whether there could be an overstatement of the impact of tariffs, let's say for electronics. So probably to look at those gains across sectors again and reframe the magnitude of those gains. Second is on NTMs, if I could say. It's easy to perceive the gains from trade from a reduction in tariffs, but NTMs, which basically we're not talking about a reduction in NTMs, we're talking about a reduction in trade costs related to NTMs, and that's why you use an ad valorem equivalent. But I was thinking that whether we could think a bit more on the gains. They may not be immediate, they may not be direct, because NTMs anyway cannot be negotiated away in a trade agreement, like in the case of tariffs. So here I would emphasize that an overriding requirement to reduce trade costs would be domestic reforms. And not coming straight on board to the agreement. So a simple ratification for Malaysia by Malaysia or membership for Taiwan would not see a direct reduction in NTMs. So what is needed is domestic reforms to simplify the procedures. And if you look at the report, what came out very clearly was the second major concern by businessmen that was reported or cited was standards and regulations. And this is perfectly understood. It's not surprising because we are trading a lot in electronics. I believe technical barriers to trade prevail, TBTs. And if you probe further with this businessman, it's not complying with the NTM per se. They have no issue, with the NTM per se, but they have issues in complying with that NTM. And that's where you have compliance procedures coming into play, such as inspection, testing, and so on. So that's why domestic reforms are needed before even you can think about standardizing the NTMs through an agreement. So possibility to look at domestic reforms before even coming on board, and also considering the fact that the number of regulations do not actually tell you anything about the stringency or the complexity of those procedures. And my third and last point is under this area of tariffs, NTMs, and trade gains is that having said that domestic requirements, domestic reforms are important, I think it's also important to relook at CPTPP, and I am very much for ratifying the CPTPP, mainly because I feel that it can prevent the protectionist use of NTMs. And it can, to some extent, force countries to redesign their NTMs to be more effective. Why? Because the provisions in the CPTPP have a high degree of enforceability. And UNCTAD has recently shown that 66% of the TBT chapter specifically indicates provisions that are enforceable. So you have a lot of agreements out there which are just obligations, which are recommendations, and in the first place, other agreements do not even have a specific SPS and TBT chapter. Here you have an SPS and TBT chapter that is specific in the agreement with high degree of enforceability. And if you look further, the enforceability surprisingly is on very related and very needed streamlining or standardization, because for the SPS chapter, it is focused on conformity assessment, and for TBTs, it's focused on labeling and marketing authorization. And these are specific NTMs that really require domestic reform. So if there's pressure to enforce countries who sign to the agreement and ratify them, then we can see this agreement having a real plus point. Second is on the harmonization of regulations. I will speak on the second area. Here, I would like to highlight from the earlier point that the CPTPP has this enforceability requirement or provision. Regulatory convergence is important. And I was thinking that the report spoke a lot about the regulations in Taiwan and the regulations in Malaysia, comparing both, especially from the NTM perspective. It would be interesting to take it further a little and to look at the regulatory distance, not just between Malaysia and Taiwan, because non-harmonization of standards are the key issue that does not allow for regulatory coherence. So to look at Malaysia and Taiwan vis-a-vis Malaysia and the rest of the countries. So possibly to, and why that is needed, because then you will be able to identify where integration is lagging within this agreement, which sectors and for which country pairs, and more importantly, to inform which country would serve as a benchmark for harmonization, which would be the denominator. Because when we looked at RCEP, for example, Malaysia had the highest regulatory distance with China vis-a-vis all the other countries. So it was something to think about when we think of about benchmarking for the purpose of harmonization. And the report adequately points out that because the CPTPP encourages, the CPTPP is not explicit about harmonization, but it's on aggregate, but it's explicit about harmonization at the sectoral level, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and so on. So you can push for sectoral harmonization if you don't want to call it harmonization per se, standardization, because it has enforceability mechanisms. But in doing so, you need to be informed about the regulatory distance between the country pairs. And that could actually potentially put CPTPP as a new frontier for regulatory coherence, which the RCEP can't do, because the RCEP does not have those kind of enforceability provisions. And my last final comment, if I may and have time, on supply chains and intermediate goods and value-added trade. A lot was spoken in the report on how Taiwan joining the CPTPP and Malaysia ratifying its membership would actually create probably greater trade expansion because of this large flow of intermediate goods in electronics, and here in this case imports of high-tech electronics. I think it will also be good to really consider that even way before the China-US trade war, not before the COVID and so on, there was already some gains from trade due to some diversions, and the gains should also be seen not through the direct partnership between Malaysia and Taiwan, but the indirect trade gains that come from third parties. It could be within the agreement, it could be outside the agreement, because the agreement contains countries like in Latin America where the density of the networks in electronics are not particularly high. The density of the networks actually center quite on China, and although people have spoken about the possibility of displacing China in GVCs, we have seen it's not quite practical. China has been quite central. We have not seen major shifts, but we have seen probably less reliance on China along the GVC. So the issue is not one of reconfiguration of supply chains, but what CPTPP can anchor itself on is reducing risks and vulnerabilities along the supply chains. So managing supply chains, because we don't only have what is called intra-regional connectivity, because we're not talking about just the Asia. Of course, we can look at the CPTPP as Asia-Pacific region, but truly there's inter-regional connectivity, because we're talking about distant countries like Chile, Mexico, and Peru. So these are new players that have not been there in terms of connectivity. So it gives that probably that opportunity for reducing risk and vulnerabilities. And the report points out adequately the key issue is about developing digital infrastructure. And here again, though I'm speaking a lot on trade in goods and regulatory coherence through the agreement, regulatory coherence in digital trade protocols are very important at the moment because of data and so on that goes through digital means. Yeah. So within the CPTPP, we have this issue of opportunity to tackle inter-regional connectivity and to reduce risks and vulnerabilities. So I will end with just 2 key points based on all the 3 issues to say that the CPTPP has enforceability provisions in NTMs that we have not seen. So it's a good platform or a potential frontier for regulatory coherence to reduce trade costs and ultimately expand trade. And my second point is that CPTPP possibly provides a logical platform for addressing some of the risks that we see arising for COVID-19 in managing supply chains and reducing risks and vulnerabilities rather than reconfiguring the whole supply chain altogether. With this, thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Right on time, actually, just 1 minute off, but and you managed to cover quite a lot of topics in your 10-11 minutes. I'm quite curious and interested in some of your points. You know, the first point that you made about the domestic reforms that are also needed simultaneously, as well as the point about well, your final point about it being a logical platform for addressing the risks with regards to COVID, and also the indirect trade gains. So I would maybe later ask you more about what you mean by indirect trade gains, and how do you think this could actually be fleshed out in terms of benefits for Malaysia and any country signing on to the CPTPP, because I imagine that these benefits are not just for Malaysia, right? Okay, but so without further ado, I want to now introduce our second panelist, and at the same time also invite anyone who is in the audience who would have questions. You can actually type out your questions in the Q&A box below. So don't put it in the chat, but put it in the Q&A box. And I think there are some questions coming in already. I see that. So Dr. Lai Yi-chung, I hope is it Dr. Lai Yi-chung or I-chung? Well, Dr. Lai Yi-chung, you can correct me if I'm wrong later, is the president of the Prospect Foundation in Taiwan. And Dr. Lai served as the Director General for the Department of International Affairs in 2007 to 2008, and the Director General for the Department of China Affairs in the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP. So prior to that, he was Special Assistant for Policy to the Taiwan representative to Japan in 2000 to 2003, and Executive Director for the DPP mission in the United States, 1999 to 2000, Vice President of the Taiwan think tank, 2013 to 2016, and he received his PhD degree from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, and was also the visiting researcher at Cornell University. So again, a very accomplished speaker from Taiwan. I would like to invite Dr. Lai to now take over the floor. Dr. Lai, over to you. And if you can have someone unmute the computer, that would be very good. So you have 10 minutes, Dr. Lai.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited here, although I'm not a trade expert. So I won't be able to make very substantive comments like Evelyn, the previous commentators about this report. Basically, I'm more of this political security side of these equations. I think I really learned a lot from this report, and I think basically this report is giving us that the CPTPP will be good for both Taiwan and Malaysia, and there will be significant, at least a good number of the increase in international trade, as well as the incentive for the domestic reform. And I think, in my view, I personally would like to know more about how about those the trade CPTPP, joint CPTPP will also increase in terms of the investment for Taiwan and Malaysia in each other's countries, especially for Taiwan, that many of the Taiwan's trade, they are investment-induced trade. So that when we're talking with other countries about the importance of the trade agreement, some of them, they argue that their purpose in engaging with Taiwan economically basically is on investment. And they want to have more investment in order to demonstrate the good number of the trade gains. Then they can justify to start the negotiation with Taiwan about the trade agreements. So just my own curiosity is that how would the CPTPP itself in a study demonstrate about the importance, again, in terms of investment for both Taiwan, Malaysia, and each other's countries if both countries join the CPTPP. And I think there are other interesting and outstanding areas. Some of them, they are outside, the development were outside of the CPTPP discussions. One of them is the supply chain restructurings, which happens and accelerated due to the COVID-19, but the incentive basically is due to the US-China trade war, and also the various kind of technology constraints that the United States places on China due to the security concern. And since the supply chain discussions and restructuring discussions started it between Taiwan, between United States, European Union, Japan. So basically, they are not really a part of the CPTPP over there. So the issue is that how will this development actually will impact the both Taiwan and Malaysia's gain when both of them join the CPTPP, and especially the some of supply chain discussions. They are not purely the trade negotiation. They are basically the industrial base, and they are talking about the upstream, downstreams, and some of the consideration is not even about the so-called low cost. It's also about the talented and how the clustering effect could be there. So and I think the discussion itself, since it is outside of CPTPP, and definitely will have a certain impact to the CPTPP itself. So I'm just curious about more study regarding the current development about the supply chain restructurings. How's that going to impact CPTPP, or how would the CPTPP country would enhance their opportunity to be the location of the supply chain restructurings? So that is sort of the different questions. And the third thing is that when we talk about the CPTPP issues, and one of the Taiwan's policy in New Southbound policies, of course, we know that the New Southbound policy is Taiwan's primarily our economic as well as other in foreign policy regarding our relationship with Southeast Asia and South Asian countries. But the CPTPP, there are only a limited number of the Southeast Asian countries in it. But but Taiwan Southbound policy is taking at the full Southeast Asia as well as India in South Asia as a very important target for the Southbound policy. And when I look at the CPTPP right now, immediately there is a competition about the country within the CPTPP versus the country outside the CPTPP in terms of Taiwan and New Southbound policy selections. So that I believe that this report, if from the Taiwan's view, could also increase the could also enhance the scope by comparing the country outside of CPTPP, but part of the Taiwan Southbound policy targets in terms of how the Taiwan and Malaysia join the CPTPP, and how that's going to affect those countries' relative attractiveness, whether that's toward Taiwan. That would be very interesting. I think Malaysia itself stayed at the juncture of one of the major targets for Taiwan in the Taiwan New Southbound Policy. But Malaysia, of course, itself is also considering CPTPP. So this kind of the uncertainty also induced whether the Taiwanese government is looking Malaysia as a CPTPP countries within the New Southbound Policy, or it is a country that is outside of CPTPP, but is part of the New Southbound policies. And for Taiwan, and also to the investors, the distinction could lead to a significant differences in terms of the priorities about the investment or economic engagement, as well as the personnel or non-economic engagement by Taiwan in terms of Taiwan New Southbound Policy. So I do not have much of the other things to add, but I just also wanted to know some of the issues. Probably that is on Taiwan, we should work on more of it. That is since year 2016, within the Taiwan domestic politics, the joining of the CPTPP also served as a political tool or incentive of the government for the domestic regulatory reform, just as a previous speaker talked about. And there's a recognition within the political leadership in Taiwan that the current regulatory system in Taiwan needs to have an extensive and substantive overhaul. And also about how the government is thinking about conducting and for the domestic economic management. And then with the CPTPP gradually started to be on hold, then the incentive or the momentum toward that kind of reform also started to stall a little bit. So I think with this report, especially the previous commentators talk about the importance of the regulatory distances. I think it will also be very good for Taiwan to know that about Taiwan's regulatory distance with other countries, so that it will probably will serve as the alert to the political leadership in Taiwan and about the current progress in terms of regulatory reform, or what kind of the regulation harmonizations that Taiwan should move forward to facilitate the Taiwan's entrance to the CPTPP if the political consideration is really not there. So I'm just end of my comments here, but mostly those are the questions from a layman participant, but I appreciate for having me here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lai. I think you've brought the discussion to a different level today, because we understand that these sorts of decisions and the decision-making process is obviously not isolated from the political questions. I mean, these are very much related to the political economic questions of the day. And it sounds very much that Malaysia and Taiwan have some shared commonalities when it comes to the issue of tools for domestic regulatory reform. And I think that's very fascinating, kind of looking at the regulatory distance of the potential signatories and the current signatories in comparison with the others. Perhaps later on during the discussion, Lawrence can take up some of the questions that you've posed, including the first one that you posed on whether this would actually increase investments in both countries. And I think we take the point that many of the discussion points actually are taking place outside of the CPTPP, including, Southeast Asia collaboration, regional collaboration, and what happens to the supply chain. So, but we can take that in the discussion session, unless Dr. Shankaran Nambiar would like to address any of that in his. But now I'd like to turn to Dr. Shankaran Nambiar, who is a Senior Research Fellow at MIER, the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research. Also very illustrious career. He has been engaged as a consultant for the Ministries of Finance, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, Ministry of Domestic Trade and Consumer Affairs in Malaysia. He's been consultant for also a wide range of international organizations, including UNESCO, UNDP, ILO, UNEC, LAC, ADBI, ASEAN Secretariat, ERIA, and JETRO. And he works on research areas such as trade policy, distributive trade, industrial development, competition policy, and poverty. He has been a visiting scholar at the IMF, the working group for the Malaysian Export Council, contributed to Malaysia's national documents such as the Third Industrial Master Plan and the Malaysian Consumers Master Plan. He has his biography goes on and on, but I think I'll stop there. He has, as I said, an illustrious career and is also well suited to speak on the issue of trade in Malaysia. So Dr. Shankaran, you have 10 minutes. I don't think you have any slides. Feel free also to respond to some of the comments that have already been made by the speakers before you, and we can then have an animated discussion thereafter. So Dr. Shankaran Ambia.
Thanks a lot, Tricia. Thanks for inviting me to speak on this very important and interesting topic. I think it's very timely given the fact that Malaysia is trying to find ways to increase its growth and trying to generate income without relying too heavily on fiscal measures, particularly since these fiscal measures are fairly limited under the circumstances. I have been following a little bit with some interest Taiwan's interest in engaging with Malaysia and in getting involved in the CPTPP. Some of this engagement or some of this interest comes with my, I should think, infrequent association with the Tsinghua Institute. And long time back, quite a very long time back, I've also visited TIER. So it's nice to be with colleagues from TIER. I appreciate the central thrust of the study, and I'm very much in agreement with the key findings. I definitely think that CPTPP offers an interesting way ahead for Malaysia, given that we are a small open economy and we need to explore new areas in which we could harvest the benefits of these agreements. And given the fact that we've had long-standing economic association, cooperation with Taiwan, I think we need to see how that can go to a new level. And I think in that respect, the CPTPP offers a new channel. I also think that that it would be natural that the benefits that Malaysia could gain via the CPTPP would be through the E&E sectors, and of course, given the great, given Taiwan's competence in that area and Malaysia's great interest in IR 4.0, actually even before COVID, it seems a natural avenue to explore. Although some of my comments might sound as if I'm not terribly pro CPTPP, let me assure you that I believe in free trade, I believe in regionalism and multilateral approach. But I'm not terribly convinced that you need to get into a trade agreement CPTPP or otherwise, in order to get internal reforms going. I think Malaysia, it's important that Malaysia institute these reforms with or without CPTPP, because I think going forward, you need to remove these obstacles, these constraints to trade. And now taking, for instance, the question of NTMs, a study that we did a couple of years back seemed to indicate that a lot of firms were not terribly, I mean, one of the things they're not terribly sure about or informed about was the availability of free trade agreements, and leading to poor utilization of these FTAs. And the other thing that they were not terribly familiar with was what needed to be done on some of these things that go to constitute barriers to trade. A lot of companies, especially the smaller ones, less worried about MNCs, the bigger companies based in Penang and the Klang Valley, but the smaller ones, even in these countries and the non-MNCs, they're not terribly familiar with testing procedures, how they get their products verified, validated by CRIM and the rest of it. And some of them thought that these are very costly procedures when actually they aren't. So I think this is an issue that needs to be looked at. That there has been, for instance, I think quite a bit of progress on trade facilitation, but firms, a lot of firms are now pitching their standards higher. They want Malaysia to achieve the same kind of trade facilitation measures as, for instance, Hong Kong or Singapore. So the benchmarking has gone up. And I think the government, the respective ministries should respond accordingly. Now, on the question of value added, I think there has to be a deeper discussion on this. There has been talk on value added. I think policymakers in Malaysia are aware that our value added is not what it should be. Value added is typically very high in agricultural kind of products, palm oil, etc. But I think this has got to translate across sectors. We are participating in a lot of global value chains, but I think we lack the technological sophistication, and that is something that we have to look at in order to benefit from more strongly from our participation in global value chains. So I think this again is something that has to be done, and it has to be done whether we get into the CPTPP or not. Will it be further facilitated by participating in the CPTPP? I think that's a very important question that we have to look at. And I think Prof. Evelyn has made some remarks on that issue. I think also that I think we should also explore, as I see it, I think there are two strands to it. One is Malaysia working more closely with Taiwan without the CPTPP, and I think that has to go on, taken to a deeper level. And then there's, of course, the question of Malaysia working with Taiwan within the context of the CPTPP. In certain respects, that seems a bit confining to me. I know that's the remit of this study, but I think it's a little confining, because I think to some extent, perhaps to a large extent, Malaysia can benefit tremendously by through economic cooperation with Taiwan to look at other markets in the region. And that would include Southeast Asia, big markets like Indonesia, also India. And I think this goes beyond CPTPP, which is not to deny the importance of the CPTPP. Finally, before I conclude, one last point. Given the, this is probably not a politically correct point to make, but I think given our current political state, we are probably not looking at the benefits of trade agreements that could be realized at some point in the future. And I don't think trade agreements are about the kinds of benefits you'll get in 6 months, in a year. They're probably the kinds of benefits you'll get 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and they go way beyond Trump, because at most he gets another 4 or 5 years, and the trade agreement would far outlive him. And I think in that respect, we have been kind of myopic. I think Tun Mahathir has, and not just him, but other policymakers have said that there's not much point in getting into the CPTPP, one, because of Trump, two, because the US has pulled out. But I think within the scheme of the political economy of FTAs, I think these are not the right kinds of considerations to look at. But again, coming back to the current political situation, it's kind of worrying, and I'm afraid this might have some impact on the CPTPP ratification. We might be in a situation where no political party would want to champion the cause, because if it does, then it lays itself open for criticism by its opponents. Not a very satisfactory situation to be in, but I think that's the reality of things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nambiar, for your very incisive comments, actually. I think broadly speaking, I mean, we know each other for a long time, and I know that you are definitely someone who believes in open trade and international linkages. But yeah, we take your point that, you know, that CPTPP may not necessarily be what is needed, and ultimately, if there are domestic reforms that are to take place, it still requires that kind of buy-in from the local stakeholders internally. So regardless of the CPTPP having been signed or not, the buy-in needs to come from within. I think that's what you're trying to say, and I'm not sure whether this would apply even to Taiwan as well, because Dr. Lai, you know, also mentioned that there seems to be a similar trajectory there. And of course, yeah, I mean, your comments on the report itself, I'm sure Lawrence will have quite a lot to respond to after this, on how it was maybe the confines of the report were a little bit limiting, but I think you raised some questions over the value added and whether the priority should in fact be looking at other Southeast Asian markets within the region, as you mentioned, like Indonesia and India. And of course, your final point about the political situation being untenable. yeah, that one's, you know, really beyond our control, but it's definitely a wise comment to make. Because, you know, discussions are not premised on the policy rationale of things much longer. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, it is 11:22 a.m. now, and we were actually supposed to end at 11:30, but that doesn't give us much time for discussion. So with your permission, I think we will extend it up to 12. So that's, you know, an additional half an hour that we can have comments from around the floor. I believe that there are 10 of you sitting at the Taiwan Institute of Economic Research in Taipei. It'll be really good to obtain any feedback and comments from your side in Taiwan, as well as addressing any questions that are coming up on the Q&A box. But before I get to the Q&A, Lawrence, would you like to address some of the comments that have immediately come out so that you can recall them? And then after that, we will open up the floor to the members of the audience physically in Taiwan, as well as virtually on the online.
Yes, thank you very much, Trisha. Yeah, I think really some very incisive inputs, I think, from all the speakers. So I'm very grateful for that. I think this is a topic that we will stay engaged in. So I think those kind of very specific suggestions of ways to take forward the research from all the speakers, I think are something that we can look at within the research team. Particularly, I would highlight, you know, I think what Professor Evelyn, your suggestion around the regulatory distance, that's something that we explored a bit, and then we were trying to think of ways to represent it. But I think that's something that's really critical. So I think I'll just pick up on like one or two comments. I think overall, I think particularly Prof. Evelyn, I think summarized this sort of tension in that we have when doing this kind of modeling, because in a way, the easiest things to model are the quite basic things about tariffs and so on. And actually, I think that CPTPP, I think the way, Prof, that you put it, is like a platform. And I don't think we should like mislead people. I don't think anyone sitting here saying that CPTPP is going to transform Malaysia's economy or anything like that. And it's also not going to drive the reconfiguration of supply chains. But what it does do is it increases that resilience and it creates more options. It's a platform for options. And that is what you want in a world where supply chains are experiencing no small degree of turbulence. And to maximize your space for opportunity in that landscape, I think is really crucial. But how you put a figure on that is quite difficult, because some of that is uncertain and some of it is about how investors and MNCs take up that choice. So that also links back to the specific question about investment and how we treat that. I think it's, to me, the biggest unknown. I think that at the moment, with the disruption that's happening in the global economy and the reconfiguration of supply chains, that feels like the big, one of the big opportunities for Malaysia and ASEAN in the next 18 months, 2 years. And even just signaling a direction on CPTPP could influence that in a way that's quite difficult to predict and capture. So I think that's why, in trying to articulate the messages from this research, yes, we talk about some numbers that we can find, but actually there's actually quite a big spectrum of potential gains that are much larger than that, but are difficult to sort of directly attribute. And I think that's why I emphasize that in my assessment, or in our assessment rather, the CPTPP is part of a strategy. You know, it's if Malaysia as an economy looks at the landscape it's in, okay, we have some regional competitiveness in some sectors, we have some existing industrial collaboration, we have an opportunity to be part of this platform that positions us to pivot into new areas, or to have more resilience and flexibility in our existing trading relationships. I think that's something that can form a sensible part of a broader strategy of trying to enhance Malaysia's competitiveness. And that's, I think, the right way to think about this, and that Taiwan's membership sort of further increases that. I think the second point that I just wanted to respond on is this point that I think Dr. Shankaran made very clearly, which is about this tension between domestic reform and CPTPP-driven reform. And I think I completely agree, and it echoes something that Prof. Evelyn said, which is, you know, even if you have great trade deals, if you have really bad compliance, it doesn't really matter actually, and businesses will still talk about the challenges of those barriers. So I think in a way, there's no substitute for domestic reform. There's no substitute for the political will that's needed, both in the implementing an agreement and also in sort of those broader areas of reform to enhance the competitiveness of the economy. So I think, again, it's about not seeing CPTPP as a substitute for domestically driven reform of the economy, but seeing CPTPP as a lever for domestic driven reform of the economy, and how we integrate CPTPP as a policy option within that strategy. And I think the good thing for Malaysia is, like, the work's done, right? I mean, you've seen in the last couple of years how painful the RCEP negotiation has been. And I think trying to do a CPTPP style negotiation now would be really, really tough in the global economy as it is. But that work's actually been done, and the mid negotiation team got a good deal. So to me, it seems like it's there on the shelf as an option, but it's not a substitute for a political decision to tackle these issues within the economy itself. I think there's many other individual discussions that I'd like to follow up on, but maybe I'll just pause there and hand back to Tricia.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for your initial comments. And I think more of the same might come up. But I'd first like to open the session to our members and colleagues who are seated at TIER's office. If any of you, ladies and gentlemen, would have any comments and responses to the discussion so far from perhaps the Taiwan perspective. Yes, I do see a hand. Unfortunately, I can't see the name, so your camera needs to be open. But I do see that someone wants to speak.
David.
Oh, David. Okay, right. Hi, David. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think we have very limited time, so I would like to make a long story short. As a matter of fact, according to your questions here, I think I have to answer that very briefly, that should Malaysia ratify CPTPP? My personal opinion is yes. Malaysia sooner or later will ratify that, but not during the short period, as Lauren has mentioned from the first beginning. And why that we can consider about that Malaysia adopted so-called open trade policy, and so-called foreign trade is so important to the economic development in Malaysia. So that means Malaysia, they need that. Aside from that, Malaysia, for the time being, they have a very well ingredient to these regional value chains. So we can consider about that Malaysia, sooner or later, they have to consider about the ratification issues. Of course, however, because of the current domestic situation, so give some restriction for them. But we think Malaysia government, they are going to have a very thorough consideration about whether or when to ratify that. So we respect and waiting for Malaysia government's final decision. And aside from that, when we are this discussion about where Taiwan's participation matters to Malaysia's economies. So we have to consider about if Malaysia, what kind of economic policy they are going to adopt in the coming years. To my understanding, for the time being, the first one is so-called Industrial 4.0, Strategic Industrial Development Program. Aside from that is so-called 12 Malaysia Economic Development Program. And these two important programs, what is their final goal? There is a view. The view is so-called shared prosperity to all the Malaysian peoples. So based on these views, so we can consider what kind of, that means what kind of best partners Malaysia is going to choose. And fortunately, from this report, we can tell that Taiwan at least is one of the best choice. We can consider about what has mentioned in the report about backward linkage relations, together with the forward linkage relation. That means clearly to mention that Malaysia is highly reliant on manufacturing sectors, and Taiwan provides is the best and largest provider to the Malaysia's so-called high-tech, intermediate, and capital goods. than to any other CPTPP members. So this is a fact. So that means if from these figures, we can find out for the time being, there is a very, very connected economic relationship between Malaysia and Taiwan, even though there is no any kind of free trade advantage arrangement for the time being. So that means after Taiwan's participation to the CPTPP, situation will change. That means it will much more enhance Malaysia's capability domestically and internationally. I think I have to stop here. But before I stop that, I also have to highlight that for the time being, there are about 160,000 Malaysian students studying in Taiwan, as Lawrence has mentioned on the presentations. Don't forget that so many Malaysian students study in Taiwan and so many tourists, according to the 2019 figures, I think it's about 380,000 Taiwanese tourists coming to Taiwan, Taiwanese tourists coming to Malaysia, and about 50,000 Malaysia's tourists going to Taiwan. So that means the people-to-people's contact is so intense and so close. So we cannot neglect that. Aside from that, we also have to mention for the time being, there are so many officials, corporations, channels, aside from the so-called Malaysia-Taiwan Economic Cooperation Committees and trade, investment, small and medium enterprise, even the industrial corporations committees remains there. But we can consider about this kind of cooperation and the contribution to the both side industrial development. This is under the situation that both countries, we don't have any kind of free trade privilege advantage arrangement. So that means after that, after we have that, after Taiwan's participation in the CPTPP, what situation will coming out? So we can consider about the positive outcome is expected. And generally speaking, I think this report is very good. It's short, but provide a very clear understanding to those important VIP who has no time to read that clearly. So I appreciate for the ideas and for the Taiwan's office in Malaysia and Malaysia's office in Taiwan to cooperate in these sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Do you have anyone else in your room that you'd like to invite to provide any comments? If not, I will go quickly to the questions from the box. Yes, okay, please.
Hello, Tricia. From this report, we see the Malaysia and Taiwan will get the benefit from to join the CPTPP. But we know that not all of the industry will get the benefit. Some of the industry maybe get the damage. Also, how do the Malaysia government to convince the industry that maybe get the damage to join the CPTPP? And any policy to help them? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hua. I think, yeah, that's very important. And that came up in one of the roundtables that we organized in KL as well when we launched the report itself. So yeah, we take David's point about the fact that Malaysia is a very open economy and has historically depended on these sorts of foreign trade exchanges. And yes, we have to think about our 4IR, 12 Malaysia Plan, shared prosperity vision. I mean, these are many things that we are trying to increase prosperity for the nation. And so David believes that this is the best way to achieve it. Dr. Hua's question is on convincing industry. I think what I'll do is I'll read out a couple of questions from the Q&A box, and then each of you can take some time to respond. I also invite Dr. Lai to be one of the panelists to respond to some of these if you feel like it. So there's a question here that Malaysia, I think this is already in the report, right, that Malaysia has FTAs with many of the countries within CPTPP except for Canada, Mexico, and Peru. But market access to these countries can actually be obtained easily by having bilateral FTAs without having to be chained to the binding rules on non-trade issues. And the person, Azran, says that Malaysia actually does not have significant trade anyway with these three countries. So whether signing on to CPTPP, to obtain access to these 3 markets, would that actually benefit Malaysia in the long sum? Jayat Menon, who is actually our own IDEAS Senior Fellow, but attached to ICS in Singapore, he asked whether RCEP, which is expected to be signed on the 14th of November, will that affect the prospects for ratifying the CPTPP? This also has come up in several other discussions in the roundtable in KL. And yeah, the question there, which we actually posed to the representatives from MITI who joined us then, whether there was a prioritization between RCEP and CPTPP. So we can answer that as well. And there's a question here about losing competitiveness over Vietnam in the region. So if we don't ratify the agreement, how do we address the regional competition issue? And how would we address the negative perception of the public of the CPTPP? I think the negative perception thing is also closely tied to like the industry question, because I think if we can convince industry about the benefits of it, then it's also in the same breath talking about the positive benefits that the nation as a whole can benefit from, since a large sector of our economy is from the manufacturing and industry sectors. And a final question from Irwan Mazwan. Since CPTPP succeeded in force among official members, right? So how have the trade progressions between member states changed? Yeah, so that's an interesting question, right? Because we already do have some countries that have ratified, and is it possible to look at the existing countries that have ratified to see how those gains could also translate in countries like Malaysia, which has not yet done it? So, okay, I think what I'll do is give a couple of minutes each to each of the speakers in successive order. And then after that, I will invite you also to give a closing remark for about like 1 to 2 minutes. So Professor Evelyn, since it's been a while since we got back to you, why don't you begin this round?
Thank you so much, Trisha, and thank you for those questions. I will just pick on the case, the first question, that we have minimal trade with many of the Latin American countries, including Canada, Peru, Latin America being Peru and Chile. I would say, indeed, I do agree with the question that trade precedes any FTA, in fact. The FTA, I believe any FTA doesn't cause immense trade expansion. There's already trade before any FTA comes about. We saw it even in the ASEAN region before AFTA was formed. The same could be said with these countries. We have had an FTA with Chile, Malaysia with Chile, we had an FTA, but there was hardly any trade. So the FTA was really not useful. And when we went down to do some field work in Santiago, Chile, we noticed that initially they thought there were prospects for the food industry. And surprisingly, there was two-way trade flows in the food sector. And a big barrier was the labeling requirements in Chile. So because of the distance, okay, distance is an issue, but at the same time, it was the differences in regulatory framework that came through in our field work. So I still go back to this idea that indeed bilateral FTAs may see a lot of things moving compared to a multilateral FTA or a bigger FTA. But again, having said that, we've had an FTA with Chile, a bilateral FTA, and we've hardly seen any increase in FTA. And we've worked with even the Chilean counterpart to promote Malaysia as a possible business partner with their businesses there. It just didn't work. So they had lots of issues. So that's on that first question. On the second, RCEP, will it affect the prospects for ratifying the CPTPP? Malaysia has stalled on the CPTPP. The reasons are numerous reasons. Of course, it started off with what Dr. Nambiar said about US pulling out from the CPTPP, and then now it's been on state trading and public procurement. But if you look at it, Malaysia has managed to also extract important concessions. Maybe the public to some extent is not aware of what has been offered in the CPTPP and what has not been offered, especially in terms of the Bumiputra issue, including restrictions on foreign equity in key sectors. A lot of concessions in these areas have not been made. So probably the public is not the initial view of CPTPP. When I attended some of these road shows, they were not very clear in what has been offered in the agreement and what has not been. So I presume the public would have the same feeling about the CPTPP. Of course, the CPTPP is considered a higher level agreement than the RCEP, and it's easier. And even then, RCEP takes longer to conclude compared to the CPTPP. So it could be the case that some issues such as trade and labor could be a potential contentious issue, because we talk about social protection for foreign workers, labor standards, and so on. So that could be, NGOs could be playing a big role in influencing the public, and therefore this negative sentiment towards CPTPP because of the ambitious issue beyond the non-traditional issues. On the third, I'm not so sure, it was on regional competition with Vietnam. Interestingly, the sustainable trade, so much has been said about Vietnam and trade diversion of the supply chains to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan, the three major beneficiaries from the US-China trade war. But yet again, if you see, they were not major relocations because Vietnam has its own issues. In fact, some of them relocated. And it was so interesting to see the recent Sustainable Trade Index. They talked about, that was just launched recently by the Heinrich Foundation. Vietnam, I think, went down in rank. And I was glad to see, because of today's talk, Taiwan maintained its ranking in the social pillar. So these are issues we have to think about. Sometimes there's an oversell of the case of Vietnam in terms of supply chain diversions and competitiveness. And the final one that I would like to, which was not completely addressed here, the domestic reforms that were said earlier. The domestic reforms that you raised, one of the questions, it's like there are also issues with NTMs in terms of the procedures in Taiwan. I did a quick search and there were issues in terms of the long, costly and non-transparent regulatory approval processes. Same thing in the case of Malaysia and many other countries. So the CPTPP in that sense is an agreement that can actually force, as I mentioned, but exactly as said by Tricia, where is the buy-in? The buy-in could be, we had the same issue when we were dealing with the streamlining of NTMs under the MPC, Malaysia Productivity Corporation. A lot of ministries were quite reluctant with the results and to make those changes. But these are like changes that do not bring about changes in the legal framework. They are at the procedural level. So it's very, it's at the standard operating procedures. But of course, it could remove some rent-seeking activities, especially when you involve multilateral approvals and probably some lack of transparency. So the buy-in may not come in from there because officials do not want to remove some of their hold on some of these procedures and approvals and so on. So that's what we found out during, but the CPTPP will force you in that sense. Anyway, ASEAN has moved into that, and we are also moving into sustainable trade. Whether we like it or not, sustainable trade has taken a back seat at the moment, but it will still be the agenda in moving trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Evelyn. Dr. Lai, would you like to come in with some of your comments? You can speak on whatever you'd like to, if you have anything in response to the questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think the when we talk about the trade, how the trade agreement facilitate trade, at least in Taiwan's experience about our trade agreement with New Zealand as well as Singapore, both of them did in the end increase the volume of our trade with New Zealand, with both of those two countries. So in our experience, I think that's positive development. And one of them is that it actually helped to enlighten an opportunity that is not directly associated with goods trade, because it started to facilitate the human flow, as well as some of the other not directly tangibles, directly related with goods, but the human activity actually introduced other opportunities. So I think some of the positive developments that experience that we had with other countries for the trade agreement, how that trade agreement increase the volume of trade as well as other opportunities. It actually stems from something that is not directly with goods trade, but eventually it results due to other activity facilitate the kind of the trade that we have. And then about the Chinese interest in joining CPTPP, I think although this morning or yesterday we probably see from the Chen Deming, the former commerce minister, talks about the China should consider joining the Japan-led trade pacts, which means CPTPP. But I think if you look at the fifth plenum just concluded last week by China, and it talks about the guiding principle for the China in the next 5-year plan, as well as the next 15 years of the economic vision. The guidance is to build up the Chinese economy through the internal circle, the dominance of internal circle, and with the combination of the external circles. So the so-called twin circle economy. The internal circle will play the most important role, and the external circle will be a complementary role, basically. And which leads to a lot of people speculated that China probably right now is seriously considering lessening the so-called interdependence with outside world, and focusing on the enhancing its domestic market, and how the China internally could strengthen in order to ameliorate some of the negative impact due to the Chinese trade disputes or the economic dispute with U.S. and other countries. And if with that, then the issue about the Chinese joining CPTPP, I personally would take the Chen Deming, his comments, more as a political signal to Japan, because the China really wanted to separate the Japan from the United States. And this, in my view, I think is more about the political messaging toward Japan about how the China is thinking about working with Japan, and so that Japan would not be too much an ally itself with the United States. So basically, I will take that as a political signaling. Now, the third issue is that the so-called Vietnam competitiveness vis-a-vis Malaysia. I'm not talking about the Malaysia per se, but yeah, in terms of the supply chain reorganizations, yes, Vietnam has been mentioned very prominently by many of Taiwan's companies about Vietnam as a new locations. Should they wanted to have the whole cluster move out of China to other places, and in the Southeast Asia, Vietnam has been mentioned very prominently as the target of the new locations. I think it has something to do with the people's perception about the easier to set up and easier to conduct the kind of manufacturing base in Vietnam. So it is not about the so-called competitiveness in the countries per se. It's more about the business decision by those people directly related with the supply chain reorganizations. And the owner of the company or the manager of the factories, they are thinking about how would they be able to fast and easily to migrate their manufacturers and out of a certain location or moving into the certain locations. About whether the Vietnam itself versus vis-a-vis Malaysia in terms of how the country economic competitiveness, I do not think that really registers very, very high in when those people there are making the decisions. So basically, it's how Malaysia is thinking about in those specific sectors, try to attract those investment. So basically, it is the incentive of taking investment rather than as an overall national competitiveness that registers in those people's mind. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lai. Before I get to Dr. Shankar Nambiar, I think I just raised one of the questions that's come up in the chat with regards to, well, this is a commonly held view that some of the major chapters that are controversial in the document are on investment, ISDS, and SOEs. And there is a belief that these chapters are not really about free trade, and that in fact these chapters benefit corporations as opposed to the well-being of the people. So Dr. Nambiar or Lawrence, you can feel free to respond to that. So Dr. Nambiar? You are still on mute. Well, I have the power to unmute you, so.
Well, that's precisely why we're scared of the CPTPP. There might be people like you who decide to exercise your power.
Take control.
Yeah, I'm just joking. Okay. I think the previous commentators have raised some very useful, valuable comments. I'll be reflecting some of them. I think as far as RCEP is concerned, I think a lot of the policy makers seem to think that is sufficient because it handles ASEAN and the trading partners and the main trading partners and China, and they seem to think concluding RCEP is sufficient, at least for the time being. And I think that loses the longer term perspective, which I mentioned just now. Now, as Todd mentioned, the CPTPP is a platform. It's part of a larger strategy. And I think that therein lies the CPTPP's importance. And who knows how the CPTPP will expand in the years to come. There might be other countries that might take an interest and want to get into the CPTPP. Possible candidates are, of course, Philippines, perhaps Thailand. And I think it might go beyond political posturing. China at some point, perhaps not in the immediate future, but China at some point might want to get into the CPTPP. Both the US and China might be interested in it for different reasons. China might think that as a global economy, a dominant economy, it should have a role to play in trade, in global trade. And the Western countries might think that this is a good way of getting China on the table, sorting differences, and perhaps also getting China more involved in rules-based trade approach. So I think one cannot completely eliminate these possibilities. I think there's another reason why the CPTPP is important, and that is it acts as a signaling device. It indicates Malaysia's willingness to embrace an FTA which has a higher standard. And I think this this signaling process would probably give more confidence to investors that there is a degree of seriousness in trying to bring about internal reforms. And finally, I think there are important political implications that come about from getting into the CPTPP. I think this is not particularly the right kind of forum to go into these issues, but I think there are important political implications, and I think it's useful for Malaysia to spread its eggs in a number of baskets. And I think some of the concerns that we'll have to, those who believe in the value of the CPTPP, some of the issues that will have to be looked at will, as I think some of the previous commentators have mentioned, we'll have to look at labor standards. We'll have to be more convincing on ISDS. And I think there's also concern that IPRs might affect the cost of healthcare. And I think the right kinds of arguments will have to come out on these issues. But as Todd said, I do agree that a lot of time, effort went into the crafting, into participating in the CPTPP. And I think unless there are extremely strong reasons, and yes, as also Todd mentioned, we did manage to secure quite a good deal. I think unless there are absolutely strong reasons, such as we are sacrificing our sovereignty, or people like Trisha might decide to unmute us without warning. She did warn me though. Unless there are such strong reasons, I don't think we should wave our hand against the CPTPP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nambiar. I'm actually deciding to wrap it up at 12, so I don't think we'll have a chance to go around for closing remarks. I'm really sorry about that, although we wanted to. But Lawrence, can I get you to speak? Just wrap up whatever thoughts that you have. And just, there's been a couple of questions also about China. I think there's a link that was shared in the chat group by some of us, by one of our IDEAS colleagues, who says that China is reported to be carefully considering to join the CPTPP. But anyway, just informing everyone about the Q&A. All right, Lawrence, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, just some really great comments from all the panelists that I don't need to echo, I think, and I think Dr. Shankar and Dana just covered the China discussion. Look, I think the only thing I would just reiterate, and it kind of comes back to Azran's comment, is, look, I think that we in discussing this, we also don't need to, so like when I talk about the CPTPP, it's not like an article of faith. Like, I'm not saying CPTPP is going to solve all the problems or that it's perfect. I think I recognize there are some things that maybe aren't best, and I think also we have to be clear that all trade deals come with adjustment, come with compromise. And I think it's about, that's why for me it's really clear that what we have to do is we have to have a strategy, a broad strategy that looks at, okay, we have this option, we have this opportunity, this platform that can play into a broader strategy we want to have of, resilient, diverse supply, participation in supply chains, coupled with, broad distribution of economic gains across the country. Okay, CPTPP can play into that. It's not on its own going to achieve all of that. And it might introduce a couple of other issues that we have to manage, but on balance, it can be part of that strategy. And I think that kind of moderate way of thinking about it, I think I find to be helpful. I think the only other point that I just wanted to make, because we didn't come back to it, and I think it was Dr. Shankaran who mentioned it, or Prof. Evelyn as well in her consultations, was around awareness. So I think this is something that we talked about in a previous roundtable, that the awareness among the business community, particularly SMEs, of what trade deals are available to them can be quite low. So I think that's an area where we can improve in Malaysia to make sure that these trade deals actually get used, and that because I think, as someone said, signing the trade deal doesn't increase trade, right? It's the businesses that increase the trade. So it's about making sure that we also equip them with that knowledge to use it. So I think the key message there is that CPTPP is a tool. It's not something to be afraid of or to worship. It's something to use. And it's about how we use it and what else we do alongside it. But I think, that being said, it's a tool that we can use for benefit and could be part of a constructive strategy for Malaysia's economy, recovery and future economy, and that Taiwan can be a strong partner in that, and CPTPP provides a platform for that partnership. So I think on that note, I will conclude, and just again, a thanks to the contributions from the panelists, because I think it's really helpful in terms of shaping the future direction of this kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you to Lawrence Todd, Research Director Ideas, Prof. Evelyn Devadasan from UM, Dr. Shankar Nambia from MIER, Dr. Lai from Prospect Foundation, colleagues and also joint organizers of today's webinar, Taiwan Institute of Economic Research. Thank you so much, Dr. Hua, for hosting your colleagues sitting in the Taipei office. We in Malaysia are very much looking forward to a time where we can also go back to our physical events. And with that, I'd like to officially conclude our webinar on CPTPP. And we look forward to future engagements. Please stay tuned. Those of you who are in Malaysia will know that Ideas will continue to conduct our research and policy advocacy, not just on economics and trade, but on many, many other important, compelling issues that are currently facing the country today. So thank you for joining us. And yes, we will be linking the recorded webinar on our website, and I think we will send it over to all the participants as well. Once again, thank you and look forward to engaging with all of you again in the future. Thank you for your comments and your feedback today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.